Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Jason, and here I talk about all things story. And the story I'm talking about today is Why I Quit the Novel, The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig. Before I begin, I want you to know that this series is not at all about denigrating, belittling, and otherwise shitting on another author's work. Writing is very difficult stuff. However, think of this as a learning experience. Think of this as an excuse to quit a novel that you maybe just don't like too much, and maybe you want to figure out why it's not that great. Me, as a writer myself, I constantly ask myself this question when I quit a book, so let us get on with it. So I did read Chuck Wendig before. I read his Star Wars book called Aftermath, and it got kind of a lot of flack. It got accused of being woke fiction. It got accused of being strangely written, and he does have a very unique writing style, one of which I highly respect and admire, and it has changed over the years a bit. It's very choppy, it's very simple, but it has a very unique flow to it, I guess. And it's not for everybody, that's for sure, but it's never really bothered me that much. I tend to appreciate it sometimes when authors go out of their way to try to develop their writing style, as long as it doesn't get in the way of immersing yourself in the story, comprehension, and just all around having a good time. So that was the last book I read of Chuck Wendig. I wasn't a huge fan of it. It was okay. It wasn't terrible. I didn't really get the woke criticism behind it, but again, some people are more sensitive to that stuff than others. And in fact, I did see that this novel has been accused of treading into that familiar territory. However, I did not get that far. Okay, I quit it far earlier than it became woke. Or maybe I just didn't notice it. So when I first saw this book, it was in a Barnes & Noble. I was on vacation, perusing the titles as I tend to do. And I saw this book across the way under the new hardback section. And what really caught my eye was that it said literary horror. So I was immediately intrigued. I love horror. I love literary horror. I love horror that, writing that's more atmospheric. Maybe there's a lot more metaphor to it. There's more depth, let's say, than jump scares or creepy things that dwell in the cellars or attics. It's a hefty book, which I was kind of surprised at. Almost 600 pages long, and I was kind of curious how a literary novel, a modern literary novel, could be that long. I tend to find that the most literary horror is a little bit shorter in length. Stuff like Stephen King, more like mainstream horror, are the ones that end up being of a tome this size. So I delved in. It was interesting. I was hooked immediately. It starts with a character who I assume is going to be the antagonist at some point. He's getting ready to be executed by the electric chair, and he's quite an interesting character. And after that scene, we are introduced to a few other scenes in different settings, but there's just some weird stuff going on. I don't want to spoil it for you if you read the book, but I was hooked. I thought it was a great hook for a novel. I wanted to learn where it was going. I had kind of a strange feeling about it, though, like it was going to go somewhere that wasn't quite horrific. There's just some things that happen a little bit later in the book, well, in the first quarter of the book anyway, that start to hint at other things, other genres perhaps. So why did I quit? Well, I quit about the 25% mark. I know I tend to tell myself, I give myself 33% or so, a third of the novel before I quit. And honestly, it was the writing. It was the writing. And I know, okay, first and foremost, let me say this. Chuck Wendig is a fantastic line-by-line writer. He captivated me on a line-by-line basis. I was always amazed at the way he crafted sentences and even white space and pacing and so on and so forth. What really bothered me was it almost sounded like he was enamored by his own craft, why he was tickled, let's say, by his ability to write interesting sentences, go off on tangents that really led nowhere, and just kind of left you scratching your head wondering what was the point of that. And it really reminded me of a film, and not in a good way. So I feel like film is a medium that is very similar to novels, but you have a little bit more flexibility in the way things are edited, right? Now I don't want you to think I'm saying that there are scenes in films that have no meaning. I'm sure every scene, no matter how short, has some kind of meaning to it. But I feel like that fits the visual medium of film much better than it does in a book. And that's really what Chuck Wendig was doing here. You'd have these really short chapters or scenes that would involve a character, that involve something that's going on, but it doesn't really seem to matter. Maybe it ends up mattering later on, but the way it was crafted, just felt like an aside, and you're just left at the end of reading that going like, man, that felt like it went nowhere. Now in film, because it is so truncated, because it's a visual medium, you can get more out of it from the actors' performances and so on. I feel like we notice it far less frequently than we do in novels. In novels, at least when I try to write them, I try to craft a chapter or a scene in such a way that leaves you wanting more. It hooks you, right? It's almost like a mini story within itself. And so anyway, that was the first time that I was really kind of taken aback and second guessing my decision to move forward. But speaking of scenes that go nowhere, I'll talk about one in particular because it really stands out to me. And it was one that just felt like it could have been edited out completely. And that's where one of our protagonists named Oliver, he's a young boy and he's starting in a new school. His family has moved. I know I really didn't talk about much what the book was about, so maybe I should start there. It's about a guy named Nathan, and he had an abusive father, and he moved away, and he started a family, and now he's moving back into that house because it was left to him, and something strange is going on, right? That's the gist of it. And so anyway, back to Oliver. He's starting a new school, and he finds a group of kids playing Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I played Dungeons and Dragons, so you'd think that I would have been very attracted to this scene, but I wasn't. And I don't mind there being scenes like this in books at all. But however, he got so in the weeds with Dungeons and Dragons from like a rules perspective, from a lore perspective, from, just magical spells and characters and so on and so forth, for really the only reason to show that Oliver was finding people that he could fit in with. And it was almost like Chuck Wendig was flexing his Dungeons and Dragons knowledge for some strange reason. And really that just speaks to a lot of the scenes in this book, is that it reminds me a lot of Joss Whedon humor. I can't stand that guy. He's a terrible, terrible writer. I know people are going to disagree with me, but he may have clever concepts, but he reminds me of Chuck Wendig in that every line of his is almost like, or every joke I should say of his is like, he's like, haha, see what I did there? I'm a pretty funny guy, huh? That's really the best way I can explain this novel, is that Chuck Wendig knows he's a great writer. He knows he's a good line-by-line writer, and he plays with that a lot here. But, he has very colorful language and very interesting setups, but there's no meat to it. It's just form without function. And I think that's really what bored me in this novel. And it was kind of strange because the first scene, as I mentioned, was a great hook. I was really looking forward to diving into this meaty tome of a horror novel. But don't be fooled. It is not literary in the slightest. I'd say this is very mainstream. It is not written in a literary way. It is not. The subject matter is not literary whatsoever. I didn't find any of that. The characters are not literary. I know that's kind of an ambiguous term, but I didn't get that feeling whatsoever. And so I slogged through meaningless scene after meaningless scene after meaningless scene until I just could not take it anymore. And it's unfortunate because I think this book probably could have worked with a lot of editing, right? I mean, the writing's good. I'm sure there's an interesting resolution. It has a pretty good rating on Amazon, but it's just all those hiccups along the way. I just couldn't take them anymore, and the journey just didn't seem like it was going to be worth whatever end awaited me. Kind of reminded me of Stephen King a little bit. Stephen King, as much as I love his concepts and I love him as a writer and I really respect what he does, he tends to go off on random tangents that don't really ever amount to anything. They're kind of set dressing, but they're not particularly interesting set dressing. And I feel like when you're writing a novel, when you're shooting a film, when you're doing anything creative from a storytelling perspective, you want to chop out all the stuff that doesn't really matter. I mean, Stephen King himself says, murder your darlings, kill your darlings. Kill the things that you hold precious that really don't serve the story. And honestly, that is the problem I had with this entire book. It was just too many scenes that went nowhere. Characters that I didn't find completely interesting. I mean, they could have gotten more interesting as I went on, but, again, hook me early. And unfortunately, he did anyway with a prologue, and then after that, it just kind of fell apart. So let me know. Did you read this novel? Did you enjoy it? Did you get through it? Or did you quit like me? And it's really tragic because it kind of reminds me of the first quitting video I did with Stephen Graham Jones, All the Good Indians, where Stephen Graham Jones is a great line-by-line writer. I just wanted the story to come together. Same thing with Chuck Wendig. I think he's a great and amazing line-by-line writer, someone I hope to learn from. The story aspect of it, right? The stuff, because a lot of people don't notice the line-by-line stuff. Sure, that is the cinematography. It is the camera angle. It is the way the camera moves to the scene. It is the editing. That is what the line-by-line stuff does. And both of those guys have it down great. But I still have to have a good story. I have to have compelling scenes. I have to have interesting characters. And if I don't have that, nothing else matters. So if you would like to see me create so you can heckle my own stuff, check out my series, Worth 1,000 Words, where I write a 1,000-word short story inspired by a piece of artwork every week. Come hang out with me on my live streams on the weekends when I have them. Check out my longer form fiction in the description below, and I will see you in the next one.